Hi, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to lecture 11 on deontology. This will be part one. We'll have two parts here in part one. We'll be talking about Kant, Immanuel Kant's version of deontology. We've been alluding to Immanuel Kant throughout the course. Many times I've referenced him. In the first part of the lecture here, we'll talk about Kant, talk a little bit more about who he is. We'll talk about deontology in general. Again, this is the first time we're really turning our attention to deontology per se. So we'll talk about it in a real general sense, try to carve out what exactly it is, what it looks like. We'll flesh out the central notion of a goodwill, which again is going to be key for Kant. We'll talk a little bit about, relatedly then, what he thinks the purpose of reason is as well. So those will be the key things that we mentioned here in the first part of the lecture. And we'll also then, at the very end of this part, talk about two of the three propositions of morality. So he's going to talk about, I think, the way to best approach Kant. Oftentimes he would approach his philosophy in a kind of interesting manner. He would suggest, we want X, well then let's talk about what the possibilities of X depend on. What is required in order to have X? And he does the same thing in a sense with respect to morality. Right? We want a viable, tenable view of morality, something that stands up. Right? Then we need to have, right? Reason's going to play a central role, and we have to have, he's going to say, this central notion of duty. And so he's going to try to flesh out via these propositions of morality, flesh out what he means by duty. And so we'll end this first part of the lecture by discussing the first two propositions. And we'll leave the third proposition then for the second part, and that's because he brings up some terms then that we'll flesh out in more detail in the second part of the lecture, where we'll talk about his idea of like a law, maxims, imperatives. We'll see clearly in both parts the relationships to Aquinas and how he talked about a law, right, and how law is a very rational sort of thing. Again, that's going to be a huge similarity between both Kant and not only Aquinas, but Locke. We're going to talk about in the part two video, his central idea of the categorical imperative and how important that is. That's going to be the golden ticket, if you will, for Kant in order to figure out what our moral obligations are. And then we'll conclude the second part of the lecture by discussing his famous four illustrations of duty. Again, he's going to flesh out, right, what this notion of duty looks like. And he's going to give us some famous examples of what duty amounts to. Okay, so that's the game plan here in terms of these two parts to the lecture. So first, right, we're going to talk about Kant himself. We've been alluding to him here and there throughout the course, and I do owe him, I think, a bit of an apology. I did kind of poison the well at the end of the lecture 10 video when I suggested at the very end, if you paid close attention, right, that it could be painful to read Kant. And in fairness to him, I should have, let you approach him totally neutrally, right, as you do probably with all these other guys. It is, and regardless of how difficult it is, who said the truth is going to be easy, right? I have actually his predecessor, David Hume, who I actually have studied quite a bit, Scottish philosopher, who came on the scene, philosophical scene, another modern philosopher, came on the scene shortly before Kant and was very influential, and Hume's skepticism was very influential on Kant, and Kant in large part is reacting to Hume's skepticism and trying to save the prospects of metaphysics, if you will. We're not going to get that deep into what Kant's doing here. We're going to stick with the morality stuff, but I'm bringing up Hume because, again, I have vivid memories of wrestling with, in graduate school, wrestling with a passage of Hume for literally hours, just one passage. And so, but nonetheless, I guess the point was that was one of the more rewarding, once things clicked, right? It was one of the more rewarding and rich sort of experiences I've had. So Hume, again, is somebody that I spent a lot of time working with. And again, the point is that just because it might be tough, maybe the reward in the end's even better then. And so Kant, in fairness to him, I think most people would agree that it is difficult, but who knows, that maybe what he's saying nonetheless is correct when it comes to morality, right? And we have to do our best to glean what exactly it is he's saying. And while I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure how much this is the case with respect to Kant, but I will throw this out there because I know from personal experience, especially with respect to other philosophers, that it's a huge deal, and that's when they're doing their philosophy in a different language, that presents a whole new wrinkle. Right? It's hard enough to try to decipher what these guys are saying if you speak their original language, but then you throw in the arduous task of trying to translate, figuring out yourself what this person's saying, and then trying to translate that into a different language altogether. That can make a world of difference. Speaking firsthand, I took a class on Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra at Boston University. Literally one book. We spent the whole semester studying this one book. And before I took the class, I had read a different translation of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I thought it was terrible, hated it. For the class, though, we read the Walter Kaufmann version, and it was a totally different experience. So at least with respect to Nietzsche, and I know it's also true with respect to the ancient philosophers. Oftentimes there's a rift in terms of interpretation, and that can have significant ramifications then in terms of what people think these, Plato and Aristotle, the other ancients, what they were saying ultimately. And so I think maybe, that could be an issue here as well, right? Kant was German, wrote in German, so we're reading it in English. That can present issues as well. So no doubt it is difficult trying to figure out what Kant's getting at, but I think regardless, again, that what he has to offer, even if you disagree with him ultimately, there's a reason why we're still talking about him 300 years later. He had appreciable points. And again, even if you disagree ultimately with his moral theory, I think you have to concede that some of the elements of what he's saying, they have an element of truth to them. They kind of ring true now, whether or not, again, ultimately you subscribe to deontology, that's a whole different matter, right? Again, I oftentimes say that I feel like I'm in a tug of war between some of these theories, right? Because they utilitarianism and deontology, they both have their appeals in different ways, right? So anyway, a slight apology to Kant there for sort of poisoning the well, if you will, and so alluding to how difficult the reading might be. Regardless of how difficult it is, he's a significant figure in the history of philosophy, not only in moral philosophy, but I alluded to like metaphysics and responding to David Hume and so on, and a huge figure. He's famous for his three critiques, these three big critiques, the critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason, which I couldn't dig up, it's around here somewhere in the house, and then the critique of judgment, or this is like aesthetics, it's philosophy of art more or less, and very famous for these three big critiques, among other works that he had. I find it funny, and I always mention that then he wrote subsequently, right, the Prolegomena. This was basically written after this, and offered kind of a dumbed down version because he felt nobody was really at least appreciating, or maybe in some sense understanding what he was saying, right, in the original. And so he writes this supposedly dumbed down, right, shorter version, which is arguably equally as obtuse and difficult to figure out. So I oftentimes joke that not even Kantians, people that study Kant academically, right, for a living, so to speak, that not even Kantians have Kant figured out. And it speaks volumes, I think, that he has to write a book after writing a book to sort of dumb it down, so to speak, so that others can climb on board and better appreciate, the merits of what he's suggesting, or at least in his opinion, that's what he was doing. Anyway, very famous dude, as I allude to on slide 2 of the lecture. Of course, a lot of these philosophers are pretty interesting guys, but I would say Kant in particular, it was a really interesting character. He's one that we would probably label as OCD these days, was known for being a creature of habit. I always ask, if this was a face-to-face class, I ask, anybody have any compulsive habits? One that I've rid myself of personally that I used to have was whenever I'm changing the volume on something, it has to be multiples, or an even number, right, or a multiple of 5. And so if it wasn't, then it would bother me, right? If it was 13 or 17, I'd have to change it. Not anymore, though. I've overcome that. You'll be happy to hear. But Kant, in that vein, was a creature of habit, and legend has it he would take his morning walks at precisely the same times every morning, and so the other citizens of his hometown Königsberg would set their watches according to his morning walks because he was always at the same point at the same time. He was that much a creature of habit. It always blew my mind that he never traveled more than 100 miles away from his hometown. Of course, back in his day, right, traveling wasn't near as easy. And then I find out my own dad didn't travel more than 90 miles from his hometown until he went to college, and this was the late 70s, early 80s. So I guess I was, again, as I alluded to in the intro to the course video, I had the good fortune of traveling quite a bit when I was younger, and so I try to always appreciate that wasn't the case for some people. And now Kant, that was probably of his own choosing, because again, he was very much a creature of habit, so he probably preferred to stay close to home at all times. Mentioned that. So he is obviously, I mentioned the extent of his influence, not only in moral philosophy, but across the board, really, in terms of all the categories of philosophy. But what kind of stands out with respect to him, maybe more so than some of these others, is that he was particularly well known in his own lifetime, which, again, isn't typically the case for most of these philosophers. And also, that seems to be true of a lot of, the classics in terms of novels, right? The novelists are only sadly discovered posthumously. So anyway, these are not light, right? Imagine reading the excerpt, right, that you read for this lecture. Imagine reading not 20 or however many pages, right, but 500 pages of that stuff, and then trying to figure it out. Again, I work more with Hume, but similar to both books, I would literally just have notes trying to figure out and dissect exactly what's going on there, and still feel helpless at times. But those are, again, some of the books he's more well known for. Let's go ahead. Oh, while I'm thinking about it, I brought this too. I dug this out of the library. This is the book that I used to work with, the previous textbook. Whenever you see me mention Poemen in the referencing like a quote, it says Poemen. It's actually two editors. I should also credit Vaughn. Poemen and Vaughn are the editors, and this is the textbook I'm bringing those quotes from. And I'll try to, if I remember, get the bibliography, the information for this book, put that up there on the website somewhere as well. Because I do quote that textbook quite a bit as well. I think it's helpful. The way they put things oftentimes is pretty helpful. So let's go ahead and then move on from our general introduction of Kant and then dive into a discussion of deontology and try to kind of iron out what it is in general. Okay, we've talked about deontology quite a bit up to this point, again, indirectly through our discussion of utilitarianism. And, for example, we're going to get to here in a moment this distinction, which you should already have on your radar because we already alluded to it back in the Nielsen lecture, the part 1 lecture of lecture 9, part 1 video of lecture 9. This is going to be a key defining feature, right? So we already know, we're familiar with that distinction. Granted, we didn't talk about it or flesh it out too much when we were discussing it in the Nielsen lecture. We're already familiar with this. We already kind of have a general sense of what deontology is through our discussion and emphasis on utilitarianism, right? We know what deontology isn't, right? It's everything utilitarianism is, essentially, or consequentialism is. So we kind of already, hopefully, at this point, have a general sense of what deontology is. Well, let's go ahead and come out and try to define it generally. So I mentioned Poemen. Here we go. Slide 3. I like the way that when they were introducing deontology, they define the moral theory, generally speaking. Right? It lies in the notion, quote, that rightness and wrongness of acts are determined by the intrinsic quality of the act itself or the kind of act it is, not by its consequences. Okay, so there's something about the kind of act it is, irregardless of what happens in our experience, right, or what we have to gain from the act. There's something about the act itself, right? And then furthermore, what the person who engaged in the act, what they had in mind, that's what's important for the deontologists, not what these consequentialists and specifically the utilitarians, what they suggest and what results in our experience, right? That's not what we've had to focus on in figuring out the moral status, the moral worth of these various actions. Rather, right, we need to look at the acts, the type of acts they are in and of themselves, and what's motivating the agents that are engaging in these actions. That's what we ought to focus on. Kant and his fellow deontologists are going to suggest. So obviously opposite of what the utilitarians and more generally the consequentialists are going to argue, or did already argue, right, as we saw in those previous lectures. Okay. So moving on then to slide 4, let's go ahead and flesh this distinction out a little bit more. Okay, so I mentioned way back, right, well not way back, but lecture 9, again that part 1 video when we were talking about Kai Nielsen, he was mentioning how this is his issue. That is the issue that he has with, as he called them, the moral absolutists, the moral conservativists, the deontologists. His issue was precisely in what Kant's going to emphasize here, the notion that morality is an a priori business. Okay? Nielsen was objecting to that. Well, here we're going to focus on precisely that, right? Kant comes out and suggests that, yes, morality is an a priori business. And what does that mean? Right? We're going to try to explain that. So, this is something Kant says, but it's not from the excerpt that we read. He says, quote, "The ground of obligation must, therefore, be sought not in the nature of man, nor in the circumstances of the world in which man is placed, but must be sought a priori solely in the concepts of pure reason." Okay? And again, I think it's best to try to, when you're approaching Kant, to try to appreciate his own approach, right? We want a viable sense of morality. Well, then here's what's going to happen. Here are the conditions upon which a viable, tenable view of morality depend. Okay, it's not going to hinge on this kind of stuff because he's going to say that's too impure. Why don't we go ahead and get into a quick example that will illustrate the kind of beef or issue Kant has with, right, these other theories, and why we have to root moral worth and morality in general, in a sense, in something being a priori, right, and pure reason. Why is that important? We'll go back to an example I've been using. Little Sammy helping the little lady cross the street. Okay, is that morally praiseworthy? Well, Kant's going to say, hold on, just because the little lady made it across the street and little Sammy's no worse for the wear, right? They're both better off. People are happier, because the utilitarians and consequentialists can say morally praiseworthy. Well, Kant's going to object. He's going to say, hold on, we got to dig deeper, right? Do we really want to praise little Billy when we find out that he was actually motivated by self-interest, right? He only went out to help the little old lady because mom and dad threatened to ground him from the Xbox if he didn't get his butt out and help her. Right? Obviously, she's struggling. Little Billy, get your butt out and help her. Well, that doesn't seem as morally praiseworthy. He wasn't going to do it otherwise, right? Or maybe he's trying to impress, the good-looking girl walking behind him, and that's the only reason why he did it. Otherwise, he would have laughed at the little lady as she gets mowed down by the. No, she wouldn't get run over, but she struggled, right? He's laughing. Otherwise, he would laugh, right? Why praise that? Kant wants to say, and we got to dig deeper. That's the sort of thing he wants to say. We can't focus on this, what happens as a result. Because we let these sort of impure things seep in. Okay, so if you want a viable, defensible view of morality, you can't start praising those sorts of situations. So instead, we have to root morality, he wants to say, in something more pure, right, and pure reason itself. Okay, we have to view morality as being an a priori business. So that's what we're getting into then. All right. So what does he mean by this? So this distinction, this a priori versus a posteriori, this reflects a distinction regarding what we know. Okay, so if we know something a priori, what that means is our knowing it didn't require experience at all to know it. No experience required. On the other hand, if it's knowable a posteriori, well, then experience is said to have been required to know it. Now, I think when I was in the Nielsen lecture, I mentioned how, in the rationalism and empiricism debate, the whole debate is essentially, in some sense, about whether this kind of knowledge even exists. Remember, the empiricists are of the opinion that no knowledge is possible without the aid of experience, whereas the rationalists want to suggest, no, there are things that we can come to know that don't require consulting experience, things that we can know a priori, so to speak. Okay, so just want to put that out there at the outset here that not everybody is even going to agree that there is this distinction, right? That there are things that we can know a priori. But Kant and other rationalist people that do advocate this distinction, what do they mean? Okay, and what does Kant mean by suggesting morality is knowable a priori? Well, he means that, okay, so again, it's a distinction about the things we are said to know. So assume we're talking about things we know, right? There's a difference between all bachelors are unmarried, knowing that, and knowing my feet smell. Or assume both are true, right? And let me tell you, they're both true. Okay, so all bachelors are unmarried versus my feet smell, or it's raining outside, right? Assuming, what's the difference there? Kant wants to say all bachelors are unmarried. You can know that solely by virtue of your rational capacity and the concepts involved. You don't need to consult experience. You don't need to go out and, investigate and inquire into all bachelors, right? Just by the definitions alone, you know that all bachelors are unmarried. You know that solely by your rational capacity. On the other hand, insofar as you know that Dr. Musil's feet smell or that it's raining outside, it's only because you experienced it, right? You couldn't know that a priori, so to speak. So that's the kind of difference that Kant is getting at here. And so Kant's saying in morality, what makes an action good, we need to locate that its rightness, its wrongness, not in experience, as these other guys are saying, because we have those sorts of situations arise where we start praising people that are motivated purely out of self-interest, and that doesn't seem proper, right? It doesn't seem to be akin to what we mean by doing the right thing. Is that really what we mean by doing the right thing when somebody's only going out there because they want to avoid being grounded? So he'll say instead we need to view morality as being knowable a priori. And of course then he owes us an explanation. Well, how do we figure it out by reason? And he's going to, as we'll see, he's going to try to do that then. And essentially the second part of the lecture, that's where we'll really get into the categorical imperative and how he thinks reason really does allow us to figure out all the moral standards there are without looking at experience, needing to look at experience, so to speak. Okay, so hopefully you're starting to get an appreciation for what he means by morality being, all our moral truths and standards being knowable a priori. Okay, they're not knowable a posteriori. We don't need to consult experience, contrary to what the utilitarians, people like Kai Nielsen, are suggesting. And remember, that's exactly what Kai Nielsen was suggesting was problematic about the moral absolutists. They viewed moral standards as being absolutes, right? As not, you don't need to look at experience, and killing innocent people is always wrong. Knife throwing is always wrong, and that's precisely the problem he wants to say, right? Because then it allowed them to let far greater evils happen. Okay? So, nevertheless, that is precisely what Kant's saying about morality, right? It is an a priori sort of thing. Okay, because Kant wants to say, well, if you view it otherwise, then you have all those other issues we just mentioned a moment ago, where you can start praising people that don't really seem, when you dig a little deeper, to be truly morally praiseworthy, because their motive or intention wasn't all that pure. Okay? So I give you similar sort of examples on the slide. Okay, another example, a priori, something we would know a priori. If Joe is alive, then he's breathing. Just by virtue of knowing what it means to be alive, we know that if he's alive, he's breathing, right? We can know that without needing to actually see Joe, et cetera, versus knowing that Joe is ugly. Let's say that that there's a consensus that everybody agreed that's true. You could nevertheless only come to know that through experience. Right? So that would be knowable a posteriori. And so remember, the upshot of all this is that Kant is saying morality is knowable a priori. We don't have to consult experience at all. We can go lock ourselves in the closet, put on our thinking caps, close our eyes, and just through rational reflection, discern all possible, in all possible moral situations, all moral obligations we have. Okay. So, certainly different than all the moral theories we've been discussing so far. Now, you'll recall, way back, this is the beginning, I want to say part 1 of lecture 7, so it was the very first video in this section 2, when right before we introduced Bentham, okay, in that lecture. and I was juxtaposing deontology and teleology, and trying to discuss the differences between those two, and how teleologists, they in a sense prioritize or say we have to flesh out considerations of the good first, and then we kind of know what's right and wrong. And the deontologists say the opposite, right? We have this kind of moral knowledge, or we know what's right and wrong, and then we should decide what's desirable or good in terms of that prior knowledge of that moral knowledge. And I said, flag this, future selves, right? We're going to pick up on this, and I think I even quoted this exact quote. I could be wrong, but we'll have to go back maybe and check that. Pretty sure I probably even did the exact quote where this is Kant, the deontologist of all deontologists, the MVP of the deontologists, where he is basically articulating that very point, right? That notion of the right, that we have what's right, our moral knowledge of what's right and what's wrong, that dictating then considerations of what's desirable, right, or what's good. Okay. And what was that quote? 194 from the text. Kant claims, quote, "There is no possibility of thinking of anything at all in the world, or even out of it, which can be regarded as good without qualification, except a good will." So, and that was, as I mentioned way back in that part 1, lecture 7 video, that is what Kant's getting at, is this, in saying that. We can't say of anything unqualifiedly that it's good or desirable, except doing the right thing itself, or having a good will. So, spoiler alert, what do we mean by goodwill? Doing the right thing. Okay? So we can't say that anything is unqualifiedly good or desirable, except having a goodwill itself, or doing the right thing. Everything else, before we can say that's good or desirable, it has to be qualified, right? Does the person who has the potentially good thing, do they have a goodwill, or do they do the right thing? Well, then, if the answer is yes, then okay, yeah, then money they have is good or desirable, or the joy they're experiencing is good or desirable. But otherwise, if no, then right, they don't do the right thing, they don't have a goodwill. Kant's point is, why deem that money, that joy that they have, desirable? Why consider it good? Okay, so all of this is, I mentioned back then, right, we'll be building up on that, referring back to it throughout the rest of the course, and here we are doing precisely that. Now, this is such an important point, this notion of goodwill and prioritizing that right over the good, and that's such an important point for Kant that we want to flesh that out, how important that point is in a few different ways here. So turning to slide 6 then, and we will revisit this actually. So we're talking about, this is all the idea of goodwill, doing the right thing. So these next few slides are all hammering home the same sort of concepts, the same point. Okay, and so we're going to be discussing real briefly here. The first way we're going to try to make Kant's point is by discussing Plato's 3 kinds of goods. And I was mentioning that we will revisit this, what is it, lecture 15 maybe? I can't remember what number the lecture is, but when we talk about Plato, the Republic, the excerpt from the Republic, we'll talk about in book 2 of the Republic, they talk about these 3 kinds of goods. And so much more on this later in that lecture. But for now, we want to make Kant's point here. So we have Plato's 3 kinds of goods. So Socrates in the dialogue is talking to his interlocutors, and I can't remember which one it was. It says to Socrates, "Socrates, would you agree that there are these 3 types of goods?" So in the course, we could have a debate about where a particular good falls, right? But he wants to say all things we consider good or desirable fall into these 3 classes. I should have made these way bigger. So he says, what order do I have them in? Things that are merely good for consequences. Then we have things that are merely good, not for what they get us down the road, but merely in themselves. in the moment, if you will. And then we have things that are good both, right, for both, meaning they're good or desirable now in the moment and for what they get us down the road. And so in that context, in the Republic, they're interested ultimately in morality or justice and what sense, and again, we'll talk about this in much more detail in that lecture. What the interlocutor wants to know, Socrates, in what sense is justice a good or desirable thing for us? And of course, Socrates is going to argue that it's the best type, so to speak, whereas the interlocutors are going to try to argue. Most people, including ourselves, are going to argue that it's only because it gets us good stuff. Okay. And so they mentioned at the time, what do we mean by things that are good merely for the consequences? Your job. For most people, but again, you can have a debate about this. I enjoy teaching, so teaching for me is obviously good for its consequences. It helps pay the bills, so to speak, right? But I enjoy it also in the moment. For a lot of people, though, if let's say your job is not one that you particularly like, okay, it's still good in the sense that it helps pay the bills. That's good. You're not out on the street, but otherwise, there's nothing particularly desirable about it. Okay, that's the type of thing we mean, or money for a lot of people. Granted, there's Scrooge McDucks out there that like to just swim in money and enjoy money in and of itself. For most people, right, money, insofar as it's good at all, and there would be people who would argue it's not good in any sense. Insofar as it's good at all, it's only good insofar as it gets us something, right, for its consequences. Okay. Now, on the other hand, we have things that are good merely in the moment or in and of themselves. And so think like someone tells a good joke, and you have a good laugh. There's nothing particularly good is going to come from that down the road, but it's great to have a laugh in the moment. Okay? That's what we mean over here. Okay, so things like joy in the moment, and then we have the most noble group, as they suggest in the Republic, things that are good both in themselves in the moment and for their consequences down the road. So they point out good health, and we've all been throwing up in the toilet, and I don't know if you're like me when you're sick and like that. You always say, "Oh, I won't complain about anything else. I just I don't want to feel like this anymore." And of course, a week later, we're complaining about everything. But health is obviously a great thing to have, and we appreciate that, when we don't have it in those moments, right? So it's a great thing to have in the moment. And there's that sense in which the healthier you are now, the more likely you are to be doing well down the road. Okay? So what's our point here, though, right? So they were talking about it, Socrates and pals in the Republic, Plato's Republic, were talking about it with respect to justice, but in their own discussion. But why are we bringing it up with respect to Kant? Well, Kant's point is, I don't care what type of good we're talking about. Nothing is good without knowing something more. We can't say that anything is good in any of these senses without knowing something more. Namely, as we've already said, that the person who has that potentially good thing, whether it be money or a job or whatever, or that enjoys that joke and it has that joy, or has that good health. None of those things are necessarily good unless the person that has them does the right thing or has a good will. So that's what we mean, right? Prioritizing what is desirable or good through this prior lens, moral lens of our knowledge, our thanks to our rational capacity of what's right and wrong, and one who properly engages in that moral process and has a good will, right? Those people are worthy of these potentially desirable things, while those who don't do that, don't take that rational moral step, don't have a good will, then they don't deserve these things. Those things aren't desirable. So I mentioned joy. Consider the joy of a criminal at the bottom of slide 6. Kant wants to say, why consider that a good thing? It's joy, but it's not good when a criminal, i.e. someone who lacks a good will, has it. Slide 7, same point. Same point can be made with respect to Aristotle's virtues. And of course, we haven't talked about virtue ethics yet in Aristotle's moral theory, but we will. I believe it's the first lecture of the next section. But Kant very famously makes the same sort of point with respect to Aristotle's, or the virtue ethicist virtues. idea of things like moderation, having this character trait or these habits of doing things in moderation, or patience. That's oftentimes thought of as a virtue in these Aristotelian discussions. Being patient, exercising patience in your actions or your behavior. Universally typically thought of as being great things, but Kant wants to say, hold up. In fact, no. Hey, these Aristotelian virtues, these can actually be, not only can they be bad, they can make a bad person far worse. So they can actually be terrible. So they'd be in other words, in the hands of a criminal, right? The criminal would be better off not having the virtue at all because it makes him far worse. So in that case, I guess it wouldn't be a virtue, right? So with respect to that, again, things like patience, okay, so Kant makes that point. In fact, in our excerpt, was this moderation, a coolness or patience? He's making that point on, I'm on slide 7 here. And I'm quoting page 195 from the text. He says, this is Kant, again, speaking to these ideas of these Aristotelian virtues and how they're not always necessarily great things. Quote, without the principles of a good will, they become extremely bad. Right? The coolness of a villain makes him not only much more dangerous, he gets away with more stuff, but also immediately more abominable in our eyes than he would have been regarded by us without it. So they're actually, the criminal is even worse with these than he would have been without them. Same sort of point, turning to slide 8, Kant discusses this idea of gifts of fortune and gifts of nature he talks about. Okay. So what do we mean by this? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. So gifts of nature are just things we're born with, right? So intelligence, courage, maybe some of us are generally pretty brave, right? Or we just have a higher IQ, some of us, right? Those are gifts of nature, or at least they're typically thought to be gifts of nature. Gifts of fortune would be things like you winning the lottery, something you come across by chance, in life. And Kant wants to make the same point with respect to both. So let's say like winning the lottery. Whoops. Think intelligence. He wants to say again, don't be fooled into thinking that these are immediately great things all the time without further consideration. No. Depends on the person that has them. So I always bring up the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. My current work is on the intersection of technology and happiness, and so I'm very familiar with the Unabomber Manifesto. Ted Kaczynski wrote the Unabomber Manifesto, and I always bring him up because it was regardless of what you think about him, if you're familiar with his case at all, regardless of what your thoughts are of him. There's no question that he was extremely intelligent. He went to Harvard, I want to say at like age 16. Got an academic position. I think he was teaching at Stanford, and then abruptly resigned and moved to nowhere in Montana because, long story short, we're not going to get into it, but he felt technological expansion implicitly enslaves us more or less, and then we lose our freedom and so on. So he's trying to get away from everything, and so in the process, he feels so strongly about this that he starts bombing people. If you're not familiar with the story of the Unabomber, he does this for decades. He gets away with this. I think it was started in the late 70s and was only caught early 90s. So he does this for decades. So he feels so strongly about this that he resigns his position, goes off into the wilderness in Montana, and literally lives for years by himself in a cabin that he built with no running water, no electricity, and so on. Just being one with nature and so on. But the point being, bombing innocent people. Of course, he would, he tried to defend his position and having to do so, but people affiliated with, technological expansion, bombing them to make his point, to draw attention to it. And the whole point here is, so look at these atrocities, right, that he's perpetuating. He's killing these innocent people, but he's smart, right, and he gets away with it for decades. And the only way, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this story, the only way he ends up getting caught is because he suggests, he writes this manifesto, and he tells these newspapers, I think 3 major newspapers, this is back again in the early 90s, if you publish my manifesto, I'll cease bombing. And so, it took some time, but, 1 or 2 of them ended up printing this entire manifesto. And his brother and his brother's wife end up reading this and thinking, that sounds a lot like Ted and his grad school rantings and so on and so forth. And so they kind of connected the dots and alerted authorities. But if it wasn't for that, look where his intelligence, the Unabomber's intelligence, got him. He got away with a lot more killing of innocent people, Kant would argue, right? So the whole point was to offer an example. Kant would say that these quote-unquote gifts aren't always gifts, right? It depends, again, on whether the person that possesses these potentially good things has a good will. If they have a good will, then and only then are they actually good or desirable. Okay, same thing with winning the lottery. If the person's going to go blow it on drugs and alcohol or whatever, blow it at the casino or however you want to put it, and lose it right away, then was it a good or desirable thing? Or I guess the more general point would be, right, if they're not a morally uprighteous person, they don't have a good will, then no, winning that lottery was not a good or desirable thing, Kant wants to say. Okay. All right, so moving on to slide 9. So there's this general sense that, the end-all be-all of morality for the utilitarians, obviously, it's happiness. And we'll see with Aristotle and the virtue ethicists, that's going to be the case too. Now they have a different, totally different sort of approach to, reaching eudaimonia or eudaimonia. I don't know. I know I don't pronounce all these, telos or telos, all these Greek terms and Latin terms properly, but I say eudaimonia. Reaching, when Aristotle talks about eudaimonia and his approach to that, it's different than, the utilitarian's approach to happiness. But happiness, or this idea of flourishing, eudaimonia, whatever you want to call it, it's central. This component is central to both the virtue ethicists and the utilitarians, their moral theory. And you can see that Kant and the deontologists, the other of the big 3 moral theories, right? I mentioned these big 3. The deontologists want to divorce, for the most part, morality from happiness. The more happiness is entering the equation in terms of why you're doing what you're doing, the less morally praiseworthy what you're doing is, and the less morally praiseworthy you are. Again, we want to eradicate those impure empirical considerations that require us to consult experience. That's going to dirty the water, muddy the water. We want instead something that's pure, right? So focusing on happiness, which is something in our experience, right? Focusing on that, it's going to, again, detract from the moral worth of what we're doing. Kant's going to argue, or does argue. So he ultimately argues that, contrary to what those camps might suggest, the virtue ethicists and the utilitarians, that even happiness is, again, only conditionally a good thing. Right? Even happiness can be, not a good thing, a bad thing, depending, again, on who has it and whether they have a good will. So that's what he's getting at when he says on page 194 of our text, quote, "A good will seems to constitute the indispensable condition of being even worthy of happiness," end quote. So all of this goes to say or show, as I've been trying to mention, as I point out in that bullet point on slide 9, Kant is prioritizing our considerations, our reflections on what's right over our considerations or knowledge or reflections on what's good. Okay. I do think it's interesting, so I do point out the very bottom on page 199 of our text. It's kind of interesting. He says, in a way, though, we do have a duty to pursue our own happiness, but only because if we're not happy, then we're not going to care about upholding our duties. So for the sake of us being better moral agents, let's also try to be happy a little bit. I always find that really odd, but he says that he's alluding to that. That's on 199. So he says we have a duty to pursue our own happiness, but only because being miserable, right, not being happy, quote, might easily become a great temptation to transgress one's duties, end quote. So for the sake of being more likely to have a goodwill and maintain that goodwill, also try to be a little happy, right? Don't be too miserable, or you're just going to give up and not care. It seems to be the suggestion. Okay. So turning to slide 10 then, we have this idea that a goodwill, right, that's what really matters. That's kind of the ruling stick, if you will. It's the measure of everything that matters, or in some sense. And you get this famous suggestion on Kant's part, that an analogy that this has all its worth in and of itself, right? Its value or its worth doesn't hinge on anything to come of it or from it. Rather, like a jewel, he famously suggests, it sparkles in and of itself, okay? Regardless of what transpires, as long as that goodwill is there. And I think there is something appreciable about this point, regardless of where you stand on Kant in general, that somebody that does the right thing, okay, whatever that might end up being, who we think kind of seems to do the right thing, no matter the circumstances, especially when crap's hitting the fan, right, and things aren't going their way. There is something that seems admirable, that, if you will, shines like a jewel about that person. I always bring up a buddy of mine who, perfect example, always has the worst luck. I mean, terrible luck. Just on and on and on. But yet he would always give you, despite all this, the proverbial shirt off his back. Would still be willing to do whatever to help someone. So, there's something admirable about that. And Kant's getting at that when he's making this analogy, suggesting that a goodwill has all its value in itself, that it, like a jewel, it shines like a jewel, right? There's something about it that's admirable and appreciable. Okay? So that's what he means when he says that a goodwill is not good because of its consequences. Rather, quote, it is good in itself, end quote. That's 195. Also in 195, quote, a goodwill is good not because of what it affects or accomplishes, for example, happiness or pleasure, nor because of its fitness to attain some proposed end. Doesn't matter what results. In fact, you could, the end of the world could result because of something that you did, right? But provided you, as we'll see here in a moment, had the right intentions and you always maintained, you exercise your rational capacity and maintain that goodwill, there's something admirable about what you did. It doesn't matter what happens afterwards and what transpired in existence or an experience as a result of your actions. Provided you had the right intentions and you have a goodwill, that's all that matters, morally speaking. Never mind whatever happens in our experience, whatever plays out in our experience. So that's, again, there's something, as he famously suggests, admirable or appreciable about the goodwill in and of itself. He says a goodwill would, quote, like a jewel, regardless of misfortunes and plights, that the person who possesses it would still shine by its own light as something which has its full value in itself, end quote. 195. Okay. So, goodwill, right? This idea of a goodwill, exemplifying that idea that we have this knowledge from the get-go, this a priori knowledge of what's right and what's wrong. We'll flesh out in part 2 of the lecture how we come to access that. It's going to have something to do with reason. Okay? We start with that, and then you want to talk about what gifts are or what's good. Well, you got to know whether or not the person that has it, right, does the right thing, has a goodwill. If that's the case, then yeah, those are gifts. Those are good things. If not, then no, those aren't actually gifts, and those aren't good things. Okay? So before we move on to his so-called propositions of morality, I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of reason. Of course, this is very much related. He has some interesting things to say. He says, so the utilitarians, right? It's all about being happy, right? So many of us are focused on wanting to be happy. It makes sense, right? We struggle with it. We're constantly focused on it. But Kant wants to make the point. You want to be happy, though. Don't look to reason, your rational capacity and reflection, because that does a terrible job. The more you turn on the reflective light, so to speak, and exercise that rational capacity, I kind of thinking about it almost as being philosophical, like reflecting. The more you do that, the more you reason on things. Kant wants to say the less happy you are, right? So what's the purpose of reason? It's not, I'll probably butcher facilitator of happiness. I'm a terrible speller, if you haven't noticed. So is it a facilitator of happiness, as so many people, would like to think? It helps us figure out our best path, right? If we would just only think about things, it helps us figure out the best path to happiness. You want to say, heck no, it's terrible at that. It does an awful job. It's very ill-suited for it. He talks about this on 196. Of course, he's going to say there's this other thing then, right? That actually, that's why we have this rational capacity. It's not to discern and mull over and figure out what will make us the happiest. And in fact, he buys in, it seems like he's endorsing the hedonistic paradox, right? In fact, if you want to be happy, if that's really what you care about, stop thinking about it. Stop reflecting so much. Right? You're better off just turning off the analytical process, the reflective process altogether, and acting on instinct. If all you care about is being happy, just stop thinking and act on instinct. And I don't know, it kind of gets into, is ignorance bliss? Those familiar with the Matrix, right? Is the blue pill the optimal pill, where we just stay happily ignorant? Or, should we, that seems to be the suggestion here, right? And then there's the red pill, where you take that and then you're awakened to, the truth, but then that's a very unhappy process. And Kant sort of seems to be suggesting something along those lines, right? That when we pursue the truth, the red pill, if you will, and engage in that rational, reflective process, it's counterproductive to a pursuit of happiness. Right? So, and actually, it seems to suggest there's this fork in the road, right? That you can't have both happiness and truth or knowledge, however you want to put it. Okay. And he would say also doing the right thing, morality. Okay? But this is an age-old classical debate. Like, is it the case that you can't that let's say that pursuing this and being reflecting and engaging in reason is sort of being philosophical, right? Is it the case that that is implicitly at odds with the attempt to be happy? In which case, should we just stop this course right now? Stop talking immediately. Stop reading this philosophy. I've oftentimes actually literally thought about this, right? Is it true that I'm less happy as a result of doing philosophy for 20 plus years? And if that's the case, should I stop? Or maybe it's still the right thing to do, even if I'm not happy, right? Or maybe it's not even the case that this is true at all, and maybe there is no fork in the road, and we can pursue the truth and at the same time be happy. But what Kant suggests here definitely seems to suggest or imply that there is a fork in the road, and that the more you reflect, pursue truth, think about philosophy, if you will, I guess, be philosophical, analyze stuff, right? That the less happy you're going to be. That if you care about being happy, don't exercise your rational capacity at all. Just act on instinct, act instinctually. Okay? And he says, so some people even kind of realize this, and this leads them to misology. So that's a fancy word. Let's throw that over here. They start to hate reason. This is the hatred of reason. So they kind of realize how, this whole idea of ignorance being bliss, that these two are at odds, and they start to despise their rational capacity as a process, and as a result, rather. And I don't know if that means they just try to dumb themselves down and stop thinking as much as possible then as a result. But this idea of misology, the hatred of reason, right? It's borne out in some people because they realize, again, that reflecting, pursuing the truth, and so on seems to make them less happy. Is the suggestion of Kant, anyway. So he says, in fact, quote, and this is on 196, the more a cultivated reason devotes itself to the aim of enjoying life and happiness, the further does man get away from true contentment, end quote. Seems to be endorsing the hedonistic paradox. I mentioned the misology point at the very bottom. So turning to slide 12 then. So why do this then if it's not going to make us happier? Well, because Kant wants to say, well, we have a more noble purpose then. It's not all about just being happy. Okay, stop focusing on happiness so much. And so he wants to say the reason helps us develop a goodwill. This is what it's truly intended for, amongst other things, to help us develop a goodwill. And this in turn reflects, as he says, and I like the way he says this on 196, that, quote, existence has another and much more worthy purpose, for which, and not for happiness, reason is quite properly intended, and which must therefore be regarded as the supreme condition to which the private purpose of men must for the most part defer, end quote. And you got to remember, when he's saying all this, he has in mind, if we want any credible sense of morality at all, we have to approach things this way. Okay? Otherwise, there won't be a view of morality that we can hold on to. Right? It'll fall apart because of some of the reasons we mentioned earlier. So again, we got to view reason as being, we have this. It's not all about happiness, right? And we have a more refined purpose, if you will, to develop a goodwill, to be rational creatures, okay? And that doesn't equate to being happy and fulfilled necessarily, but it is what it is, I guess. So a goodwill, quote, always holds first place in estimating the total worth of our actions and constitutes the condition of all the rest, end quote. 197, right, from our text. So, turning to slide 13 then. So we talked about purpose of reason and how a lot of this, and this, by the way, gets to one of the intermission questions, the stuff we were just talking about. Oops. Alluding to the red and blue pill, that third question, the intermission question. This whole idea is ignorance bliss. Is there really a fork in the road here? Or can we travel the same path that arrive to both truth and happiness? Anyway, we'll move on then to dive into the propositions of morality. And I always stop after discussing the second one when I'm in class and we take a break, because actually that's a good point then to start with the third one, because there's a lot of concepts involved that we'll flesh out then to get into really the focus of the second part of the lecture will be sort of how Kant is it then that we come to figure out by way of reason, a priori, all the moral standards and truths, right, that are out there that it would apply, right? How do we figure all that out? And we'll flesh all that out. And the third proposition, again, has some of those concepts like a law involved. And so I always like to start them the second part with that third proposition. So we'll begin in this part of the lecture and go to the intermission with the discussion of the first two propositions. So these propositions of morality are him attempting to flesh out or spell out, again, what's necessary to have a viable notion or concept of duty. So he thinks duty, you have to have this idea of duty, which is like, doing what you ought to do in a moral sense, okay? And so to have a proper sense of duty, again, if we want any viable version of morality, what are the conditions for the possibility of any viable version of morality? This is what has to be the case. We have to have this pure, as we'll see, a pure a priori sort of sense of duty and respect for this sense of duty. Okay? And he's going to spell out then with these propositions of morality what he means by duty is essentially what he's up to. So let's go ahead without further ado and dive into the first proposition. Yeah, so I mentioned that. So this will be slide 14. So the first proposition is not actually in our excerpt. He says, an action must be done from a sense of duty. This is a quote. If it is to have moral worth, end quote. So an action must be done from a sense of duty if it is to have moral worth. So he's suggesting, again, that what we're doing is only morally praiseworthy if the reason we did it, right, if it was out of a sense of duty, okay, if it was done from a sense of duty. If what motivated us was not this respect for the categorical imperative as we see and respect for our duty, but rather trying to impress the good-looking girl walking behind us or trying not to get grounded from the Xbox. If that's what motivated us, well, right, that's no good. So again, the same ostensibly good thing, helping the little old lady cross the street, that was actually only a morally praiseworthy thing that you did, or let's put it this way, you are only actually morally praiseworthy in doing that if you did it from a sense of duty. Okay, so here we're going to distinguish, how do I want to put that? Yeah, let's put it that way. So it's one thing to act, let's put it this way, as duty, let's put this up here, requires, and then it's another thing to do something because duty requires. And I guess I should say that this verse is kind of misleading. His point is that this, actually let's make these check boxes, right? So his point is this isn't good enough, as it seems to be for so many other theorists, right? Right, helping, okay, so we know, first off, we know if you're robbing a bank, you're not acting as duty requires, right? You're not morally praiseworthy. But his point is, take examples where it seems like what they do or they are doing is on the face of it morally praiseworthy. It does seem to be as duty requires, right? So he's going to say, for example, we have an obligation to help people when it's possible for us. So little Billy running out there to help the little lady cross the street was acting as duty requires because he has a duty to help others in need. Kant's point is, some people would immediately start praising. Kant's point is, no, that's not good enough. Okay, you've only checked off one box. We got to dig deeper. What was his motive or his intention? Lo and behold, it was selfish. So he didn't cross off or didn't check this box. He wasn't doing it because he has a duty. He was doing it because he didn't want to get grounded or he wanted to impress a good-looking girl. Right? So that's Kant's point. You got to check both these boxes. Okay, again, if you're robbing a bank, you're hitting somebody in the face, you're winging pencils at your, this is one example I always give in class. If you're winging pencils at your instructor's face, obviously you're not acting as duty requires. But just because you're doing it, you're refraining from winging pencils at your instructor's face, and you have a duty not to, right? You're acting as duty requires. Well, that's not good enough, because the only reason why you're not doing it is because you don't want to get expelled. We know the truth, right? Otherwise, you'd be winging pencils at my face all the time because you find me annoying and want me to shut up, right? So you got to dig deeper, right? And lo and behold, we figure out your motive was you only wanted to refrain from getting expelled, right? It wasn't because you appreciated you had a duty not to be hurting your instructor. Okay, so in that case, right, we have a duty to keep ourselves alive, sustain our existence. Kant's point is most of us aren't morally praiseworthy just for keeping ourselves alive, because that's not why we're doing it. We're not doing it because we realize we have a duty to do it. We want it. Okay, so just because we're acting as duty requires doesn't mean we're morally praiseworthy then, because we don't have the proper motive. Now, some of us might be properly motivated, right? We might realize we have an obligation or duty to sustain our existence, as Kant would say. In which case, okay, you're acting both as and because duty requires. But for most of us, just because we're sustaining our existence, as we all are, insofar as we're still breathing, right? That doesn't mean we're immediately praiseworthy just because we're upholding our duty to sustain our existence. That had to be the reason why we were doing it. That had been the because. Right? And I should say, while I'm thinking about it, because otherwise I'll forget, there's a schism, right? What about people that experience joy in doing the right thing? That's always a tricky scenario, right? Because you can't, the issue for Kant, right, is if it makes you feel good in doing the right thing, so to speak, and upholding your duty, if that's why you're doing it, then you're not morally praiseworthy. But provided, and we'll see what exercising our rational capacity and taking the moral step looks like in lecture 2, or part 2 of this lecture, provided you are engaging in that rational process, you are taking the moral steps, you recognize what your duty is, that's fine. Then you are still morally praiseworthy. All the better that you're also experiencing pleasure in doing the right thing. Okay, but that step had to have been there, right? You have to engage in that rational reflective process. Notice the similarities to Aquinas here in the reflection, right? That reflective process has to be there, okay? Provided that's there, then it's okay to also be happy in doing the right thing, all the better, okay? But if that's lacking, and if you are worse, yeah, right, if you're doing it because then it makes you happy, Kant's going to say that's not good enough from a moral perspective, right? You're acting as duty requires, and doing what all your duties are, right? But you're only doing it because, not because they're your duties, but because they make you, in doing the duties, right, or upholding the duties, it makes you happy. And that's not a pure enough motive or intention for him. That's not something we want to be praising from a moral perspective. If we want to, again, if we want a viable, tenable, defensible view of morality, then we can't be praising people like that are only doing the right thing because it makes them feel good. Okay. But again, just to make it clear, my whole point, the impetus for me bringing all that up, that just because you do become happy in doing the right thing doesn't automatically disqualify you from moral praise, provided you are taking that rational moral step, reflecting on the categorical imperative and so on, then you can still be morally praiseworthy. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. So I mentioned pretty much all that. Let's turn to slide. Basically mentioned all that too. So doing, benevolence, helping others. Obviously, its whole point. You're doing as duty requires. We do have a duty to help others, okay? But we need to know more. Okay? If you're doing it because you like having your name on a plaque for donating X amount of money, that's not morally praiseworthy. Okay? So that's through slide 15. Let's turn then. I think that makes hopefully some sense. So that was what he's getting at in the first proposition of morality. And I always say, honestly, in class, and I'm sure if there's some deontologists out there, some Kantian expert, they will say, no, there's plenty of nuances and differences here. But I honestly feel like these propositions are getting at the same underlying point in slightly different ways. And so maybe we'll see how that is here. So the second proposition, let me go ahead and put this up here first. So we have the what you're trying to do, and think of the why, like what was in your mind before you did it, right? Whatever you did. Okay. Now he's going to use a lot fancier terms when he says this is from our text on 200. So this is the second proposition of morality. It's a little longer, so bear with me. He says, quote, an action done from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose that is to be attained by it. So purpose, what you're trying to bring about, okay? But in the maxim according to which the action is determined. We'll flesh what he means by a maxim out in a little bit more detail in the second part. Okay, but basically, think of it for now as kind of a motive, right? The motive that's determining the action. The moral worth depends, therefore, not on the realization of the object of their action, but merely on the principle of volition, according to which, without regard to any objects of the faculty of desire, the action has been done. So we also have the principle of volition, he says. Okay. And versus the realization of the object of our action. So here's one of the many ways I would argue that what Kant's saying could be far simpler, I believe. And so I tried to say it much simpler here. The what and the why. And that's what I'm trying to do here on this bullet point. So the what we're trying to do, again, if we're robbing a bank, okay, obviously that is not morally praiseworthy, okay? That's not going to be, he wants to say that's not where we, I guess let me go back. So the what, right? What we're trying to do, that's not where we want to locate moral import or moral significance. That's not what matters most morally, okay? The what, or the purpose of our action, or what we're trying to bring about, okay? Rather, it's the why we're doing what it is we're doing. That's really what we need to focus on when it comes to fleshing out what matters morally. Okay? So think of it like you could have, so this is getting back to the point I was making a few slides ago, where provided everything's good here and you have the right intention, and you have a good will, and you engage in the proper rational reflective process, you could be wildly unsuccessful right? Unsuccessful in bringing about whatever it is you're trying to do, right? You could fail miserably and use your imagination. I'll give you an example in the next slide. Kill like 20 people in the process, right? In the process of trying to do something that was, your duty and so on. His point is, it doesn't matter. You were trying to uphold your duty. You exercised your rational capacity, figured out the categorical imperative, figured out what you had to do in the situation, and so it didn't matter that in the execution of whatever it was you were trying to do in your experience that you failed, right? And then as a result, terrible things happen. You are still morally praiseworthy, and in fact, you're more morally praiseworthy than, take the opposite, someone who saves billions of lives, right? So it is wildly successful in bringing about the object of their action. Let's say it's curing cancer or something like that. But alternatively, they were they wanted to go down in the history books and enjoy fame and fortune and so on for being known for doing that. Right? They didn't have the proper principle of volition, as you might say. Right? The proper why. They weren't motivated by their duty. Rather, they were entirely selfishly motivated. And so, again, that's what he wants to say, is that's what matters, right? So imagine somebody that was wildly successful, accomplished great things in our experience, but then had the wrong motive, and they are not morally praiseworthy. They are morally blameworthy people, he wants to say. Again, even though on the face of it, great things happen in our experience, that doesn't matter from a moral perspective. At least that's how we ought to approach morality, he wants to say, if we want any viable, defensible view of it. And otherwise, we're going to have all those other issues that we started the lecture off. We're going to have all the kinds of issues that the utilitarians face. Start praising people that are doing things out of selfish, motivations. Blah blah blah. So I'll give you another example. Oh, here we go. Okay. So I kind of spelled out some of this. I give you another kind of extreme example because I think what he's saying is kind of extreme. So this is on, was that slide 17? I give you a very similar example to what I just mentioned. Right? Imagine two people, person A and person B, and person A wildly successful in curing world hunger, okay, but totally wrong motives. Okay, they just want to go down in the history books, make a lot of money, and so on. Not morally praiseworthy. Alternatively, take person B, wildly unsuccessful, kills 75% of the world's population. Actually, let's make it as bad as possible. 99.999% of the world's population. Use your imagination. Kant's going to say, doesn't matter. This person was trying to do the right thing, uphold their duty to help others. Okay? Doesn't matter what transpired then in the actual execution of the action, trying to, cure world hunger. They were trying to do the right thing. Doesn't matter what transpired in existence after that point, right? All that mattered was what precipitated the action, and they had the right why, so to speak, right? They had the right motive, or maximus, you might say, the proper principle of volition. Right? They were trying to do what their duty required of them, so to speak. Right? So person B, although they killed 99% of the world, more than that, are the morally praiseworthy people, okay, because they have a good will. Whereas person A, although they cured world hunger, they didn't have a good will, and they're not morally praiseworthy. So it gets real interesting when you say things like that, I think. So, I don't know. You have a good taste of deontology at this point in Kant's version of it. I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. I mean, that does seem pretty extreme, that sort of example at the end. But nonetheless, as I was alluding to at the beginning of the lecture, what he's saying does seem appreciable, right? Do we want to praise people like little Billy helping the little lady cross the street when what they're doing is solely born out of their desire to promote their own interest? Does that really seem morally praiseworthy? Some people might say it doesn't matter. I mean, he's still doing something that increases the aggregate happiness in the world, so we still have to praise him. So some people are willing to just accept that, but I think what Kant's saying rings true for a lot of people, resonates with a lot of people, this idea that, maybe that doesn't sit so well, this idea of praising someone that is doing something that's promoting happiness, but is only doing so for selfish reasons. Doesn't that seem morally problematic? And so, again, I like to point that out because we will get into issues with Kant, we already have. But I think that's an appreciable point, regardless of ultimately where you stand on his moral theory or deontology. That sort of emphasis and that notion that, look, what are the alternatives? What we have to spell out what's necessary if we want a defensible version, because theirs isn't because of that kind of reason. So here's how we have to approach it, and that's kind of the way he's proceeding here. So anyway, we've gone on long enough. We'll wrap it up. Again, some interesting intermission questions, I think. Well, the part 2 version, or rather part 2 video for the lecture 11, we'll get more into the role of reason and how that then spells out what we ought to do and how that leads us to the categorical imperative, which is the golden ticket really for Kant, right? How we figure out all our moral duties, so to speak. And we'll talk about some important concepts like law, imperative, maxims, which we already mentioned. And we'll get into his famous distinctions to underlie his then famous examples of duty. So 4 famous examples of duty. And actually we'll end the lecture, part 2, by discussing an important distinction between autonomy and heteronomy, being acting completely on your own, of your own accord, versus being, influenced by outside forces, acting heteronomously in that case. And Kant is going to argue that one is only truly morally praiseworthy if one is doing something entirely of their own accord, right? They've come to decide to do that through a process that was entirely of their own, right? Through rational reflection. And they've decided to do it themselves versus being steered or dictated by speed limit signs or what their mom and dad said or something like that, right? All these external forces, Kant wants to say. They have to do the right thing and realize what that is themselves and be doing it solely of their own accord, autonomously. Otherwise, there's nothing morally praiseworthy about what they're doing. So we'll finish actually with the distinction. I meant to mention that earlier too. That's all then, again, what you have to look forward to in the part 2 video of lecture 11. So stay tuned. Thanks.